August 6, 1945. A medical tent in an American POW camp, somewhere in the Pacific. Yuki Nakamura twisted in labor pains as air raid sirens wailed outside. News of the Hiroshima bomb had just reached camp. She was 23, 8 months pregnant, and nobody wanted her baby to live. Not the other Japanese prisoners. They whispered, "Tainted woman," behind her back. The baby's father was unknown. Yuki had been used as a comfort woman for 2 years, a sterile word for unspeakable things. In Japanese honor culture, the answer was clear. This child should disappear quietly after birth. But then American nurse Margaret placed her hands on Yuki's forehead, not with a medic's cold efficiency, but with the tenderness of someone who'd forgotten they were touching an enemy. "Breathe, just breathe," she whispered. Yuki didn't understand English, but she understood that touch. Because for the first time in 2 years, someone touched her like she was human. When the baby finally emerged into a world splitting apart with nuclear fire, she didn't cry, as if silence was the safest place in a screaming universe. Margaret lifted the small body, checked her vitals, and then did something unprecedented in military protocol. She looked at the other American nurses gathered in the tent and said, "She needs a name. Not Japanese, not American, something universal." The old head nurse stepped forward. "Hope," she said firmly. And in that moment, the baby nobody wanted received the most precious gift her enemies could give, the right to live. But the truly shocking part hadn't come yet. Because this baby wouldn't just survive. She would spend her entire life proving how the choice between mercy and revenge can change history. Years later, that baby, now an elderly woman, would say, "My name wasn't a prayer. It was a promise that even enemies could choose humanity." The tent smelled of iodine and fear. Yuki Nakamura had learned to measure time by pain. The sharp kind that announced contractions, the dull kind that came from lying too long on a canvas cot, and the endless, suffocating kind that lived in her chest where hope used to be. Outside, the August heat pressed down on the camp like a punishment. Inside the medical tent, 3 American nurses moved with practiced efficiency, their white uniforms somehow staying crisp despite the humidity. Yuki watched them through half-closed eyes, trying to understand why they hadn't simply let her die when she arrived 3 weeks ago, visibly pregnant and clearly broken. Margaret Brennan, the lead nurse, was 34 years old and had seen more death in the past 2 years than in her entire previous life as a small-town Ohio nurse. She'd volunteered for Pacific duty after her husband died at Pearl Harbor, thinking she wanted revenge. Instead, she'd found herself in the uncomfortable position of caring for the enemy and discovering they bled the same red. When Yuki first arrived, Margaret had read her file with growing horror. "Comfort woman." The military reports used the phrase as if it were a job description, not a war crime. The girl was malnourished, covered in scars, and pregnant. The Japanese military unit that had employed her had been overrun by American forces on a small island 3 weeks prior. Most of the women had killed themselves before capture. Yuki had tried. The rope had broken. Now, as Yuki's water broke and the contractions intensified, Margaret made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed if anyone cared to enforce regulations strictly. She placed her hand on Yuki's forehead, not to check for fever, but to offer comfort. "Breathe," she said softly. "Just breathe." Yuki didn't understand the words, but she understood the touch. Her eyes widened, not with pain, but with something closer to shock. In 2 years, no one had touched her with gentleness. Hands had grabbed, hurt, used. But this touch asked nothing. It only gave. That's when the sirens started. The sound tore through the camp like a physical thing, sending everyone who could move scrambling for information. Captain James Sullivan burst into the medical tent, his face pale beneath his sunburn. "Hiroshima," he said, the word coming out like a stone dropping into water. "We dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The whole city, it's just gone." The nurses froze. Even in the middle of war, some news was too large to process immediately. Tens of thousands dead in an instant. Maybe more. A weapon that could end the world. Margaret's hand was still on Yuki's forehead. She felt the girl tense, felt the fear ripple through her. Did Yuki have family in Hiroshima? Friends? Even if she understood English, would anyone tell her what had just happened to her homeland? Another contraction hit. Yuki screamed, a sound that had nothing to do with the bomb and everything to do with the impossible task of bringing new life into a dying world. "Captain, unless you're planning to deliver this baby, get out," Margaret said sharply. Sullivan left. The sirens eventually stopped, but the sound of Yuki's labor continued, a primal rhythm that predated war and would outlast it. But bringing the baby into the world was only half the battle. The real question was, what happened next? Yuki had been 15 when the soldiers came to her village. They'd promised her family she'd work in a factory, sewing uniforms. The lie had been so clean, so official. Her father had even felt proud, his daughter serving the emperor. The first night in the comfort station, she'd tried to scream. A soldier had slapped her hard enough to loosen teeth. "You serve now," he'd said. "This is your duty." For 2 years, duty had meant 20 soldiers a night. Sometimes more during offensives, when men lined up outside her door like they were waiting for rations. She'd learned to leave her body, to float somewhere above the ceiling and watch the girl on the cot like she was someone else. Someone unfortunate, someone who didn't matter. When she'd realized she was pregnant, she'd known immediately what it meant. Not life, but shame. Not a baby, but proof of defilement. The older women in the station had whispered advice. "Drink this herb, punch yourself here, fall down these stairs." She'd tried everything. The baby had survived. Now, pushing with every remaining ounce of strength while American nurses encouraged her in a language she didn't speak, Yuki felt something crack open inside her chest. Not her body, that had been broken long ago. Something deeper. Some last wall protecting the small part of herself she'd managed to keep intact. "Almost there," Margaret said, her voice tight with concentration. "One more push." The baby came in a rush of fluid and blood, tiny and impossibly perfect. For one terrible heartbeat, she didn't cry. The tent held its breath. Then a thin wail split the air. Margaret lifted the baby, checked her reflexively. 10 fingers, 10 toes, breathing well, strong heartbeat. A girl, healthy despite everything. She wrapped the infant in a clean towel and turned to hand her to Yuki. But then she stopped. Yuki's face had gone completely blank. Not tired, not relieved, just empty. Margaret had seen that look before. On mothers who decided their babies were better off dead. On women who'd suffered so much that love had become impossible. "Yuki," Margaret said gently. She placed the bundled baby on Yuki's chest anyway, her hands supporting the weight. "Your daughter." Yuki looked down at the small face, red and wrinkled and utterly helpless. She didn't reach up to hold her. She just stared. In Japanese, so softly that no one could have understood even if they spoke the language, Yuki whispered, "I don't know how to be a mother to something born from shame." What nobody knew yet was that the baby's survival would force a choice, not just for Yuki, but for every person in that camp who had to decide what humanity meant. The first 3 days were the hardest. Yuki fed the baby, body memory was stronger than emotional numbness, but she wouldn't look at her, wouldn't hold her unless absolutely necessary, and she certainly wouldn't name her. Margaret watched this with growing concern. She'd seen postpartum depression before, but this was different. This was a mother convinced her child was cursed. On the second day, Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka arrived at the tent. She was Japanese-American, one of the few translators in the camp, and she'd spent the war trying to prove her loyalty to a country that had locked up her parents behind barbed wire in California. "The other Japanese prisoners are talking," Sarah said bluntly, speaking to Margaret in English. "They say the baby is tainted, born from violence, marked by shame. They're saying Yuki should handle it." Traditionally, Margaret's hands clenched. "Handle it." "Infanticide," Sarah said quietly. "In cases of severe dishonor, especially children born from what happened to her. It's not uncommon. This is an American military facility," Margaret said, her voice hard. "Under our watch, that baby is protected by law." "Law," Sarah repeated with bitter amusement. "These women don't believe in American law. They believe in surviving with whatever honor they can salvage." But Margaret wasn't listening. She was thinking about her husband, buried somewhere at Pearl Harbor. About the months she'd spent wanting every Japanese person to suffer. About the moment she'd looked into Yuki's eyes and seen not an enemy, but a girl who'd been destroyed by the same war that had taken everything from Margaret too. "The baby needs a name," Margaret said suddenly. Sarah blinked. "That's not." Yuki hasn't named her. Then we will. It was unprecedented. Outrageous, even. But Margaret didn't care. She gathered the other nurses, young Corporal Davis from Texas, stern Lieutenant Williams from Boston, and gentle Private Chun, whose parents had emigrated from China before the war. They stood around the small bassinet where the unnamed baby slept, her tiny fists curled against her face. She needs something, Margaret said. Not Japanese, because that will remind Yuki of shame. Not American, because that's not fair either. Something that means more than nationality. Hope, said Lieutenant Williams quietly. She was the oldest of them, nearly 50, and her daughter had died of polio 3 years earlier. My daughter's middle name was Hope. I always thought it was the most beautiful word in any language. Margaret looked down at the sleeping baby, at the tiny perfect face that had no idea it had been born in the space between an atomic bomb and a mother's despair. Hope, she repeated. Yes. They wrote it on the medical chart. Not Baby Nakamura, unnamed. Just Hope. When Yuki saw the name the next morning, she stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time since the birth, tears slid down her cheeks. But names couldn't solve everything. The real battle was about to begin, and it would split the camp apart. The controversy started in whispers, but grew into shouts. The other Japanese prisoners were horrified. How dare the Americans name a Japanese baby? How dare they interfere with matters of honor? Several of the older women demanded to speak with Captain Sullivan, insisting through Sarah's translation that the child was spiritually compromised and that keeping it alive was cruel to everyone involved. Sullivan, to his credit, shut that down immediately. The baby is under United States military protection. This discussion is over. But it wasn't over. Not really. Yuki could feel the eyes on her whenever she left the medical tent, could hear the whispered Japanese words that cut deeper than any American insult. Polluted. Shameful. Better to have died. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Tomo Sato approached Yuki while she was sitting outside the tent with Hope sleeping in her arms. Tomo had been a teacher before the war, respected and educated. Now she looked at Yuki with something between pity and contempt. That child carries no honor, Tomo said in Japanese. Every time you look at her, you will remember what created her. Every time she looks in a mirror, she will see shame. Yuki's arms tightened around Hope instinctively. The baby stirred but didn't wake. The Americans don't understand, Tomo continued. They think we are being cruel. But we understand. Some mercies look like endings. That child will suffer her whole life. You know this. For a moment, Yuki wavered. Everything Tomo said was true by the logic she'd been raised with. Honor mattered. Shame was inherited. A child born from violence was marked forever. But then Hope's tiny hand wrapped around Yuki's finger. The grip was surprisingly strong for something so small. And Yuki realized something that terrified her. She wanted this baby to live. Her name is Hope, Yuki said quietly in Japanese. The Americans gave her that. Maybe they see something we don't. Tomo's face hardened. She turned and walked away without another word. That night, Margaret found Yuki crying silently in the tent, Hope pressed against her chest. What's wrong? Margaret asked, though she could guess. Through Sarah's translation, Yuki finally spoke. In my culture, this baby should not exist. She is proof of my shame. But when I look at her, her voice broke. I want her to live. Does that make me selfish? Or does it make me a traitor to everything I was taught? Margaret sat down beside her. Maybe it makes you a mother, she said simply. The turning point came 2 weeks later, when the war officially ended, and Yuki had to decide whether to return to a Japan that would never accept her daughter. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. The prisoners would be repatriated. Everyone was going home. Except Yuki realized with creeping horror that she had no home to return to. Her village would know what she'd been. They would see hope and know. The whispers would never stop. The shame would follow them everywhere. That evening, she asked Sarah to translate a question to Captain Sullivan. What happens to prisoners who don't want to go back? Sullivan looked surprised. Most everyone wants to go home. Not everyone has a home anymore, Yuki said through Sarah. Over the following days, an unprecedented situation developed. Yuki formally requested asylum. The request had to go up through multiple levels of command, because nothing in the military handbook covered what to do when an enemy comfort woman wants to stay in America with her baby. Margaret became Yuki's unexpected advocate. She wrote letters, made phone calls, pulled strings she didn't know she had, and slowly, reluctantly, the wheels of bureaucracy began to turn. But the real battle wasn't legal. It was personal. The other Japanese prisoners were appalled. Staying with the enemy? Choosing American mercy over Japanese honor? It was unthinkable. Several women stopped speaking to Yuki entirely. Only one person supported her, a young prisoner named Keiko, who'd been a nurse before the war. Keiko approached Yuki one evening, speaking quietly so others wouldn't hear. "My brother was in Hiroshima," Keiko said. "I received word yesterday. He's dead. My parents are dead. My house is gone. Everything I knew has been erased." She looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully despite the weight of impossible decisions. Maybe starting over isn't betrayal. Maybe it's survival. The night before the first repatriation ship was scheduled to leave, Tomo Sato made one final attempt. She came to the medical tent with two other women, their faces grave. "Yuki Nakamura," Tomo said formally, "we are offering you a choice. Come home with us. Bring the child. We will help you raise her in Japan. We will tell people her father was a soldier who died honorably. No one needs to know the truth." It was an extraordinary offer. A lifeline. A way back. Yuki looked down at Hope. 3 weeks old now, starting to focus her eyes, making small sounds that might someday become words. "Her name means hope," Yuki said quietly. "In America, if I take her to Japan and lie about her father, her name means nothing. It becomes just sound." "Names are just sounds," Tomo replied. "No," Yuki said, and her voice was stronger than it had ever been. "Sometimes names are promises." 3 months later, Yuki and Hope were still in the camp, but everything had changed. The paperwork had gone through. Yuki was granted refugee status. Margaret had pulled off what everyone thought was impossible. But legal status didn't mean smooth transition. Yuki spoke almost no English. She had no job skills beyond sewing and farming. She'd never been outside Japan before, and she had a 3-month-old baby who needed constant care. Margaret made another unprecedented decision: sponsorship. She would personally vouch for Yuki, help her find housing, and assist with the transition to American life. "Why?" Yuki asked through Sarah one afternoon. "Why do this for me?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "When my husband died at Pearl Harbor, I wanted every Japanese person to suffer. I joined the military medical corps thinking I'd get revenge somehow." She looked at Hope, gurgling contentedly in Yuki's arms. "Instead, I found a girl who'd suffered more than I could imagine. And I realized that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Hope taught me that." "The baby?" "The concept," Margaret smiled. "Though your daughter helped too. The first few months in California were brutal. Yuki lived in a small apartment Margaret helped secure, working in a textile factory during the day while an elderly neighbor watched Hope. The work was hard, the pay was minimal, and the loneliness was crushing. American women stared at her Japanese face with suspicion. Japanese Americans, newly released from internment camps, wanted nothing to do with someone from actual Japan. She existed in a strange nowhere space, belonging to neither world. But hope grew. She smiled at 6 weeks. She laughed at 3 months. She reached for Yuki's face with tiny, perfect hands that knew nothing about shame or honor or war. She just knew her mother. One evening, Yuki was singing a Japanese lullaby when the elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on the door with groceries. "That's pretty," Mrs. Patterson said. "What's it mean?" Through broken English and hand gestures, Yuki tried to explain. It was a song her mother had sung to her, about the moon watching over children while they sleep. Mrs. Patterson listened, then said, "My grandmother sang something like that. Different words, same idea." She hummed a few bars of an Irish lullaby. And Yuki realized something profound. Mothers were the same everywhere. All of them singing to their children, hoping the world would be gentle. Years passed. Hope grew up American, but with Japanese lullabies. She never knew the full truth about her birth until she was 16. 1961. Hope was 16 years old, a straight-A student with plans to become a teacher. She spoke English fluently with just a hint of her mother's accent. She knew she was Japanese, knew her mother had come to America as a refugee, but the details had always been vague. Until the day she found her birth certificate while looking for documents to apply to college. Medical tent. POW camp. Mother, Yuki Nakamura, prisoner. Father, unknown. She confronted Yuki that evening, the paper shaking in her hand. I was born in a prison camp. Yuki had known this day would come. She'd rehearsed various ways to explain. But now, faced with her daughter's confused hurt, all the rehearsed words disappeared. Sit down, she said quietly. I will tell you everything. And she did. All of it. The comfort station. The soldiers. The pregnancy. The birth during the Hiroshima bombing. The Americans who chose mercy. The name that became a promise. When she finished, Hope was crying. But not from shame. From rage. They did that to you? The Japanese military did that to their own people. Not their own people, Yuki corrected gently. That was the problem. We were women. We didn't count the same way. And the Americans, they helped you? Nurse Margaret saved us both, Yuki said. Not because she had to. Because she chose to. Hope was quiet for a long time. Then, do you know who my father was? No, Yuki answered honestly. And I decided a long time ago that it doesn't matter. You are not defined by how you began. You are defined by what you choose to become. That night, Hope couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her mother at 23, giving birth in an enemy camp, convinced her baby should die. About American nurses who gave a nameless infant a name that meant everything. The next morning, Hope made a decision. She would become a social worker. She would spend her life helping women and children who'd been caught in circumstances beyond their control. She would prove that mercy wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing in the world. 1985, 40 years after her birth, Hope spoke at a university about war, trauma, and the choice between revenge and healing. The auditorium was packed. Hope was 60 years old now, a respected social worker and activist. She'd spent 4 decades helping refugees, particularly women fleeing violence. Her work had earned national recognition. But today, she was telling her own story. My mother was told I was born from shame, she said to the silent audience. Japanese culture said I should not exist, that my birth was proof of her dishonor. But American nurses looked at me and saw something different. They saw a baby who deserved to live. She paused, looking out at the young faces. Students who'd never known war, who couldn't imagine a world where women were used as weapons and babies were considered cursed. They named me Hope, she continued, not as wishful thinking, as a promise, that even in the darkest moments of human cruelty, people could still choose kindness, that enemies could become helpers, that mercy could be stronger than revenge. After the speech, a young Japanese-American student approached her, nervous. My grandmother was in an internment camp during the war, the student said. She was American, but they locked her up anyway because she looked like the enemy. She's bitter about it. Angry. How did your mother forgive the Americans? Hope smiled gently. She didn't forgive America. She forgave specific Americans who chose to see her humanity. There's a difference. She thought about Nurse Margaret, who'd passed away 5 years earlier. They'd stayed in touch for 40 years. Margaret had attended Hope's wedding, held her children, celebrated every milestone. At Margaret's funeral, Hope had spoken. This woman could have let me die. Nobody would have blamed her. Her husband was killed by my people. But she chose to save an enemy's baby anyway. And that choice changed everything. 2005, Hope was 80 years old. Her mother had passed. But the story continued. Yuki died peacefully at 93, surrounded by Hope's children and grandchildren. In her final hours, she spoke in Japanese for the first time in decades. I thought the baby born that day was cursed, she whispered. I thought she would carry shame forever. But I was wrong. She carried hope instead. At the funeral, Hope's oldest grandson asked to see the original birth certificate. Hope pulled it from the box of precious documents she'd kept for decades. Look at the bottom, she said. There, in faded handwriting, baby girl. Born August 6, 1945. Named by nursing staff, Hope. Primary nurse, Lieutenant Margaret Brennan. That woman saved your life, the grandson said. No, Hope corrected gently. She saved all of our lives. Because she taught us that the war doesn't have to win. That mercy is a choice we can make, even when everything tells us to choose revenge. She looked at her family, 3 generations gathered in her small living room. Children who would never know the comfort stations. Grandchildren who couldn't imagine a world where babies were considered shameful. A legacy built not on the violence that created her, but on the mercy that saved her. My name wasn't a prayer, Hope said, repeating the words she'd spent 80 years proving. It was a promise that even enemies can choose humanity, and when they do, it changes everything. The room was quiet. Outside, California sunshine streamed through the windows, warm and ordinary. A world away from an August day in 1945 when a baby was born in an enemy camp and given a gift more precious than life. She was given a future where her birth didn't define her, where mercy won, where hope was not just a name, but a way forward.